David never thought his job studying alien languages would put him on a spaceship heading toward the unknown. At 32 years old, he was one of Earth's best experts at understanding how aliens might communicate. But there was one big problem. He had never actually met a real alien before. For years, David worked in a small office on Earth, looking at strange signals from space and trying to figure out what they meant. He studied old artifacts that crashed on distant planets and spent countless hours learning patterns in alien writing. It was quiet work, the kind where you sit at a desk all day and rarely talk to anyone. David liked it that way. He was good with languages and patterns, but not so great with people. That all changed when the government came knocking on his door 3 years ago. Something terrible happened. A human mining ship accidentally destroyed an alien research station. In the Zephyrian system, it was a mistake, but try explaining that to an entire alien empire that now wanted revenge. The aliens, called Zephyrians, had technology far beyond anything humans could imagine. Their ships were faster, their weapons more powerful, and they had been around for thousands of years while humans had barely started exploring space. Now, those same Zephyrians were building up their war fleet, and every day brought humanity closer to complete destruction. Earth's colonies scattered across different star systems were like sitting ducks. If the Zephyrians decided to attack, it would be over quickly. The government needed someone who could talk to them, someone who understood their language and culture. That someone, apparently, was David. When they first asked him to join the peace mission, David almost laughed. Him talk to aliens? He could barely order coffee without stumbling over his words. But then they showed him what would happen if the talks failed. Pictures of destroyed colonies, estimates of how many people would die, projections showing human civilization wiped out within months. David realized he didn't have a choice. This wasn't about his comfort zone anymore. This was about survival. The ship they put him on was called the Harmony, and it was humanity's first real attempt at building a diplomatic vessel. Everything about it was designed to show the aliens that humans came in peace, no weapons, minimal shields, and a crew trained in first contact protocols rather than combat. David spent months on board as they traveled through space, studying everything humanity knew about Spherian culture. What he learned both fascinated and terrified him. The Zephyrians had a society based on honor and strict social levels. Everyone had their place, and stepping outside those boundaries was considered deeply wrong. They valued tradition above almost everything else, and had customs going back thousands of years. Their technology was so advanced it seemed like magic. They grew their buildings instead of constructing them. And their ships were alive in ways human science couldn't explain. But the most important thing David learned was that the Zephyrians were in the middle of their own political crisis. Their old emperor was sick and dying, and his 2 children were fighting over who would take control. The older child, Princess Lirelei, had been sent away from their home planet 10 years ago. After disagreeing with her father's policies, she believed in treating younger species like humans with respect and guidance rather than force. Her younger brother, Prince Kelrix, thought differently. He saw humans as dangerous pests that needed to be eliminated before they became a real threat. With each passing day, his influence over the Zephyrian military grew stronger. David knew that when the Harmony arrived at the Zephyrian homeworld, he would be walking into a situation far more complex than anyone on Earth realized. This wasn't just about apologizing for an accident or negotiating compensation for damages. This was about convincing an entire alien empire not to wipe out humanity while they dealt with their own family drama and succession battle. As the ship dropped out of hyperspace and the alien world appeared on their screens, David felt his stomach twist with nervousness. The planet below was beautiful in an otherworldly way, covered in what looked like crystal forests and floating cities that defied gravity. But somewhere down there were beings who could decide the fate of every human in the galaxy. David had studied their language for months, practiced their formal greetings until he could say them in his sleep, didn't read every report about their culture. But as the Harmony descended toward the planet's surface, he realized that all his preparation might not be enough. He was about to meet Princess Lirelei, the one person who might be able to stop a war. And he had no idea if she would even listen to what he had to say. The landing platform they directed the ship to was massive, clearly designed for vessels much larger than the Harmony. As David prepared to leave the ship, his hand shook slightly. The fate of billions of people rested on his ability to communicate with beings he had never seen before. Using a language he had only learned from computer files and recordings, taking a deep breath, David checked his translation device one more time, straightened his diplomatic uniform, and prepared to step onto an alien world. Whatever happened next would determine whether humanity had a future among the stars, or if their brief journey into space would end in destruction. He didn't know it yet. His life was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. Nervous language expert who was afraid of talking to strangers was about to become the bridge between two entirely different worlds. And the key to saving not just human civilization, but finding something he never expected to discover among the stars' love that transcended every barrier he thought existed. The crystal spire rose from the alien city like a living mountain made of glass and light. As David walked toward it, his legs felt like jelly. The building seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, and strange patterns of color moved through its walls like slow lightning. Everything around him looked alive in ways that made his human brain struggle to understand what he was seeing. Zephyrian guards flanked the entrance. David tried not to stare. They were tall, much taller than any human, with skin that shimmered like oil on water. Their faces were angular and sharp, with large eyes that seemed to see right through him. When they moved, it was with a grace that made David feel clumsy. Just watching them, the inside of the crystal spire was even more overwhelming. The walls curved and flowed like they had been grown rather than built. Soft music seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, and the air itself felt different, thicker somehow, with a sweet smell that reminded David of flowers he had never seen. His escort, a silent Zephyrian official, led him through corridors that changed color as they walked. David tried to remember his training about Zephyrian architecture, but nothing had prepared him for this. The building felt more like being inside a giant living creature than a structure made by intelligent beings. Finally, they reached a vast chamber at the heart of the spire. The ceiling stretched up so high that it disappeared into misty light, and the floor was made of something that looked like crystal but felt soft under his feet. And there, standing in the center of it all, was Princess Lirelei. David's first thought was that she was nothing like the intelligence reports had described. Yes, she was tall, nearly 7 feet, but the pictures hadn't captured how she moved. Every gesture seemed to flow into the next, and her 4 arms moved independently in ways that were both alien and strangely beautiful. Her skin was a pale blue-silver that shifted and changed patterns as David watched, and her eyes were large and golden, with no pupils that he could see. She was terrifying and magnificent at the same time. David had practiced his opening statement for weeks. It was supposed to be a formal greeting in High Zephyrian, expressing humanity's regret for the accident and their desire for peace. He had rehearsed it so many times he could say it backwards. But when he opened his mouth, something went terribly wrong. Instead of asking for peace talks, David accidentally offered to trade cattle for mining rights. The words came out before he could stop them, and as soon as he heard himself speaking, he knew he had messed up completely. The princess's skin suddenly flashed with rapid patterns of color. Bright reds and oranges flickered across her face, and arms in a display that David was sure meant anger or insult. He'd studied Zephyrian color language, but these patterns were too fast and complex for him to understand. All he knew was that he had probably just started a war with his first sentence. Panic set in. David's mind went blank, and he started apologizing in broken Zephyrian, mixing up formal and casual words in his desperation. He used the wrong tense for everything, accidentally called the princess by a word that meant something like shiny rock lady, and somehow ended up asking if she wanted to buy a spaceship, but then something unexpected happened. Princess Lirelei made a sound that David couldn't identify at first. It was musical and rhythmic, coming from deep in her chest. As the sound continued, David realized what it was. She was laughing. The color patterns on her skin had changed to soft blues and greens, and her whole posture relaxed. When she finally spoke, it was in perfect English, though her voice had a musical quality that made every word sound like part of a song. "You are the first diplomat to visit our world who bothered to learn our language," she said, and David could hear something like amusement in her tone. "Badly, but the effort is appreciated." David felt his face turn red with embarrassment, but the princess continued. "Most of your people come here with machines that translate for them. They never try to understand us, only to make us understand them. Your mistakes tell me more about your character than perfect words ever could." Relief flooded through David, followed quickly by curiosity. This wasn't how he had expected first contact to go at all. The princess seemed genuinely interested in talking to him, not just delivering formal statements and sending him away. Over the next few hours, they talked about everything. Princess Lirelei asked about Earth, about human customs, about why humans made music and art when it served no survival purpose. David found himself explaining concepts he had never thought about before: democracy, individual choice, the human belief that everyone should have a chance to decide their own future. In return, the princess told him about Zephyrian society. Their world was ancient, she explained, with traditions that went back thousands of years. Everyone knew their place and role from birth, and questioning the established order was seen as dangerous chaos. But during her 10 years of exile, she had studied other species and begun to wonder if there might be better ways to organize society. "Your people fascinate me," she admitted, as the alien sun set outside the crystal walls. "You are so young. As a species, yet you create new things constantly. You change and adapt and argue with each other about how things should be done. To most Zephyrians, this looks like madness, but I think it might be wisdom." David found himself looking at her differently as they talked. Yes, she was alien in ways his mind could barely process, but there was something in her golden eyes that was universal intelligence, curiosity, and a kind of loneliness that he recognized. She was an outsider in her own world, just like he often felt in his. But their conversation was interrupted when a Zephyrian messenger burst into the chamber, speaking rapidly in their own language. As the princess listened, the colors on her skin shifted to darker patterns, blacks and deep purples, that David instinctively knew meant trouble. "What is it?" David asked, though part of him already knew the answer would be bad. Princess Lirelei turned to him, and for the first time since they had started talking, she looked truly alien again. "My father, the Emperor, is dying faster than expected. My brother Kelrix has convinced the War Council that humanity represents an immediate threat. The attack fleet is being prepared for launch." David's heart sank. "How long do we have?" "Kelrix has his way. Your colonies will be under attack within days," she replied, "unless we can find another way to stop this war before it begins." The weight of responsibility settled on David's shoulders again. He had come here hoping to negotiate some kind of treaty or agreement. Instead, he had found himself in the middle of an alien civil war with the clock ticking down to humanity's destruction. But he had also found something he hadn't expected: an ally, maybe even a friend, in the most unlikely place. Looking at Princess Lirelei, David realized that their conversation had changed something fundamental. This was no longer just about preventing a war between species. It was about two individuals from completely different worlds who had somehow found common ground. And maybe, just maybe, that connection would be enough to save both their peoples from a conflict that would destroy everything they both cared about. The next morning, David woke up in guest quarters that felt like sleeping inside a giant seashell. Everything was curved and smooth, and the walls glowed softly with their own light. He had barely slept, his mind racing with thoughts about the dying emperor and the war fleet being prepared somewhere above their heads. When Princess Lirelei arrived at his quarters, the colors on her skin were darker than he had ever seen them. Deep purples and blacks swirled across her face and arms. And David was beginning to understand that this meant she was deeply worried or afraid. "We need to talk," she said, without any greeting, away from listening ears. She led him through hidden passages in the crystal spire that he hadn't known existed. These corridors were smaller and older, carved from natural rock rather than grown. From living crystal, the air was cooler here, and their footsteps echoed in ways that made David feel like they were walking through ancient caves. Finally, they emerged onto a balcony high up on the spire. The view was breathtaking, the entire Zephyrian capital spread out below them, with its floating gardens and impossible architecture. But David barely noticed the scenery because Princess Lirelei looked more troubled than he had ever seen her. "My father died an hour ago," she said simply. David felt his heart sink. "I'm sorry for your loss." She made a gesture with two of her arms that David had learned meant acceptance of sympathy. He was a good ruler, but set in old ways. Now my brother Kelrix is declaring himself emperor, and the first thing he wants to do is launch every ship we have at your colonies. How long do we have?" David asked, though he was afraid to hear the answer. "The attack fleet launches at dawn. Tomorrow, by the time they reach your nearest colony, it will be too late for any kind of negotiation." Princess Lirelei turned to look at him directly, but there might be another way. She began telling him about something called the Sacred Bond, an ancient ceremony that hadn't been performed in over 1,000 years. It was a ritual that could create permanent peace between two different species, but the requirements were so extreme that most people thought it was just a legend. Two representatives, one from each species, undergo a ceremony that links them together permanently, she explained. Not just politically, but mentally and spiritually. It works any act of war between their people's causes, both bonded individuals to die instantly. David stared at her. "That sounds incredibly dangerous." "It is. If the ceremony fails, both people die anyway. And even if it succeeds, they are changed forever. The human would gain some Zephyrian abilities and a much longer lifespan, but would never be fully human again. The Zephyrian would be forever connected to someone their people consider inferior." The weight of what she was suggesting hit David like a physical blow. She was talking about a permanent change to his very existence, a transformation that would make him something between human and alien. But she was also talking about the only chance to save billions of human lives. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked, though part of him already knew the answer. Princess Lirelei's skin shifted to softer colors, pale blues and greens that David had learned meant uncertainty or vulnerability. "Because I believe it might work. And because of all the humans I could be bonded to. You are the only one who has tried to understand us rather than just use us." David walked to the edge of the balcony, looking out over the alien city while his mind raced. Back on Earth, he had been nobody special, just a language expert who preferred books to people.
Ow.
Now he was being asked to literally sacrifice his humanity to save his entire species. But it wasn't just about saving lives anymore. And David was honest enough with himself to admit it. Over the past 2 days, he had developed feelings for Princess Lirelei that he didn't fully understand. She was brilliant and brave, standing up against her own people's prejudices even though it cost her everything. When she talked about her dreams of a better future for all species, her skin would glow with colors that made his heart race. Was it love? And yet, when he looked at her, he saw past the alien features to something deeper, a kindness and intelligence that felt familiar, even if her physical form was not. "What would happen to you?" David asked. "If we did this ceremony, what would you lose?" Her skin darkened again. "My people would never accept me as their ruler if I was bonded to a human. I would lose any chance to reform our society, to make us better than we are now. But I would be tied forever to someone my family considers beneath our notice." That doesn't sound like a very appealing offer for you. Princess Lirelei was quiet for a long time, and David watched the patterns on her skin shift through different colors as she thought. Finally, she spoke. "During my exile, I studied many different species. Humans fascinate me because you believe that individuals can change the world, that one person's choices matter. Most Zephyrians think fate is fixed, that everything is predetermined by ancient laws and customs." She moved closer to him, and David caught a scent like flowers and starlight. "But when I talk to you, I feel like I can choose my own future. That maybe the old ways don't have to be the only ways." David realized that she was taking as big a risk as he was. She would be giving up her throne, her people's respect, and probably her family's love, all for the chance to stop a war and maybe build something better. The sun was setting over the alien city, painting the sky in colors that had no names in any human language. David had maybe 12 hours to decide whether to undergo a ceremony that would fundamentally change what he was, binding him forever to an alien princess who might be the only person in the galaxy who could understand him. "If we do this, David," said slowly, "and somehow survive it, what happens next?" "I don't know," Princess Lirelei admitted. "The old records are incomplete. We would be entering completely unknown territory." David looked at her. Past the alien features and the shifting colors of her skin, he saw someone who was as scared and uncertain as he was. Someone who was willing to risk everything for peace, for the chance that two different species could find common ground. "When would we have to decide?" he asked. "Soon. The ceremony takes most of the night to complete, and it has to finish before my brother's fleet launches. If we're going to do this, we need to start preparing now." David closed his eyes and thought about everyone he knew back on Earth, his quiet life, his small apartment, his work translating alien signals in a basement office. Then he thought about all the human colonies scattered across space, full of families and children who had no idea their lives hung in the balance. When he opened his eyes, Princess Lirelei was watching him with an expression that somehow looked hopeful and terrified at the same time. What exactly would this ceremony involve? David asked, and knew that he was already making his choice. The temple complex was unlike anything David had ever imagined. Hidden deep beneath the crystal spire, it felt ancient in ways that made his human mind struggle to understand. The walls were made of living stone that pulsed with a slow heartbeat, and strange symbols glowed and faded along the corridors. It's like breathing lights. Princess Lirelei led him through passages that seemed to change shape as they walked. David kept reaching out to touch the walls for balance, but each time his hand made contact, he felt warmth and something that almost felt like recognition, as if the building itself was aware of his presence. "These temples are older than our recorded history," Princess Lirelei explained as they walked. "They were here when my people first learned to speak, and they will be here long after we are gone." David tried to wrap his head around that kind of age. Humans had only been in space for a few centuries, and here he was walking through corridors that had existed for millions of years. It made him feel incredibly small and incredibly significant at the same time. They finally reached the ceremony chamber, and David's breath caught in his throat. The room was enormous, with a ceiling that disappeared into misty darkness above. But what took his breath away were the trees. They weren't like any trees from Earth. These were made of crystal and light, growing up from the floor in impossible spirals and curves. Each one was a different color, and they hummed with a music that David could feel in his bones. Some were tall and thin like silver needles, while others spread wide with branches that looked like frozen lightning. "The keepers of memory," Princess Lirelei said, gesturing to the crystal trees. "They are both priests and living records. Everything that happens here will be remembered forever." As they approached the center of the grove, the trees began to react to their presence. The humming grew louder and more complex, and lights began to dance through their crystal branches. David realized that these weren't just decorations or even simple life forms. They were intelligent beings far older and more sophisticated than either humans or Zephyrians. One of the trees, larger and more elaborate than the others, extended what looked like a branch toward them. Princess Lirelei placed one of her hands on it, and immediately the entire grove erupted in patterns of light and sound. David watched in amazement as information seemed to flow between her and the ancient beings, a conversation in colors and music that his human senses could barely detect. When she finally stepped back, her skin was glowing with patterns David had never seen before. They remember the last sacred bond ceremony. It was performed between a Zephyrian and a member of a species that no longer exists. The bond worked, but she paused, and David could see uncertainty in her posture. But what? The records are unclear about what exactly happened to them afterward. They became something new, something that was neither of their original species. The keepers say it was beautiful, but also that it was lonely. David felt a chill run down his spine. They were about to undergo a procedure that had been performed exactly once before. by beings who had then disappeared from history. But looking around at the crystal trees and feeling the weight of millions of years pressing down on him, he realized that some risks were worth taking. "How do we begin?" he asked. The ceremony itself was both simpler and more complex than David had expected. They stood facing each other in the center of the grove, while the crystal trees began to sing in harmony. The music was unlike anything David had ever heard. It seemed to come from inside his own body as much as from the trees around them. Princess Lirelei reached out with all four of her arms, and David took her hands in his. The moment their skin made contact, the world exploded into sensation. David felt like he was falling through Princess Lirelei's memories. He saw her childhood in floating gardens filled with impossible flowers, felt her confusion and hurt when her family sent her away for asking too many questions, experienced her loneliness during years of exile on distant worlds. But he also felt her hope, her deep belief that different species could learn to understand each other if they just tried hard enough at the same time. He sensed that she was experiencing his memories. She felt his quiet childhood on Earth, his struggles with social situations, his wonder when he first realized that there might be intelligent life among the stars. She experienced his determination to build bridges between different kinds of beings, even when it scared him. The sharing of memories was intense, but it was just the beginning. The crystal trees began to extend thin tendrils of light that touched both David and Princess Lirelei, and suddenly the ceremony became something far more profound. David felt his consciousness expanding, touching alien thoughts and emotions that his human brain had never been designed to process. But just as the bonding reached its deepest point, everything went wrong. The chamber doors burst open with a sound like thunder, and armed Zephyrian soldiers poured into the sacred space. Leading them was Prince Kelrix, Princess Lirelei's brother, his skin flashing angry reds and oranges as he shouted commands in rapid Zephyrian. "Stop this abomination," he roared, raising a weapon that looked like it was made of crystallized lightning. "I will not allow our royal bloodline to be polluted by this primitive creature." The interruption sent shockwaves through the ceremony. The crystal tree's song became discordant and painful, and David felt like his mind was being pulled apart. The connection between him and Princess Lirelei, which had been growing stronger by the moment, suddenly became chaotic and unstable. "Princess." Lirelei cried out in pain, and David tried to reach for her. But the energy flowing between them had become wild and dangerous, instead of the controlled bond the ceremony was supposed to create. Something completely unexpected was happening. David felt his consciousness slam into Princess Lirelei's with the force of a collision. But instead of bouncing apart, they seemed to stick together, their thoughts and emotions tangling in ways that the ancient ceremony had never been designed to handle. He could suddenly hear her thoughts as clearly as his own voice, feel her emotions as if they were his own feelings. The crystal trees were singing in alarm now, their lights flashing in patterns that hurt to look at. The ancient beings were trying to stabilize the ceremony, but the damage had been done. Whatever was supposed to happen had gone completely off course. Prince Kelrix was still shouting, but David could barely hear him over the chaos in his mind. He was experiencing double vision, seeing the chamber through both his own eyes and Princess Lirelei's simultaneously. Her fear and determination mixed with his own terror and resolve, until he couldn't tell which emotions belonged to whom. And then, suddenly it was over. The singing stopped. The lights faded. David and Princess Lirelei collapsed to the floor, still holding hands but no longer glowing with the ceremony's energy. For a moment, the only sound was their breathing and the distant hum of the crystal trees. But something had definitely changed. David could still feel Princess Lirelei's presence in his mind, not as an intrusion, but as a natural part of his thoughts. When he looked at her, he knew without words that she was experiencing the same thing. They were still two separate people, but connected in ways that went far deeper than the ceremony was supposed to create. Prince Kelrix approached them with his weapon still raised, but one of the crystal trees extended a branch to block his path. The ancient being made a sound like wind chimes in a storm, and every Zephyrian in the chamber, including Prince Kelrix, immediately stopped moving. Princess Lirelei struggled to her feet, and David felt her effort as if it was his own. When she spoke, he could hear her words both with his ears and directly in his mind. "The bond is complete," she said, and David knew she was right. Whatever had just happened to them, there was no going back now. The crystal trees had spoken, and even Prince Kelrix couldn't ignore their ancient authority. But as David and Princess Leorelle were escorted from the temple under heavy guard, David could feel the prince's rage burning like a furnace. Through his new connection with Princess Leorelle, he sensed her own mixture of triumph and terror. The bond had worked, but now they had to survive long enough for it to matter. "The fleet launches in 2 hours," Princess Leorelle whispered to him as they were marched through the corridors. David heard her both with his ears, and directly in his mind, a double sensation that was still strange and wonderful. Kelrix thinks he can ignore the sacred bond by claiming it was incomplete due to the interruption. David's heart sank. Can he do that? And not legally? But if he destroys your colonies before anyone can challenge him, it won't matter what the law says. They were separated and placed in different holding chambers, but the physical distance meant nothing now. David could feel Princess Leorelle's presence in his mind as clearly as if she were sitting next to him. More than that, he could sense her thoughts and emotions, and she could sense his. It was overwhelming and comforting at the same time. Through their connection, they began to plan. Princess Leorelle still had loyal supporters among the Zephyrian nobility. People who remembered her father's teachings about honor and justice. If she could reach them and prove that the sacred bond was valid, they might be able to stop the attack. But first, she needed to escape her brother's guards and claim her rightful place as ruler. David, meanwhile, had an idea that was either brilliant or completely insane. The human ship Harmony was still docked at the spaceport, and its crew was probably wondering what had happened to their diplomat. If he could get to them and use the ship's communication system, he might be able to contact Earth's defense forces and warn them about the attack. But more importantly, he was beginning to understand something about Zephyrian technology that no human had ever realized before. Through his bond with Princess Leorelle, he could sense the living ships in the attack fleet above them. Zephyrian vessels weren't just machines, they were biological creatures, bred and trained for war, but still capable of independent thought. What if we could talk to them? David asked Princess Leorelle through their mental link. Talk to the ships themselves? That's impossible. They only respond to their commanders. But I'm not fully human anymore, am I? And you've always been able to communicate with living technology. Together, maybe we could reach them. It was a desperate plan, but it was the only chance they had. While Princess Leorelle used her knowledge of the palace's secret passages to escape her guards, David convinced his captors that he needed medical attention after the ceremony. The Zephyrian guards, unsure how to handle a half-transformed human, brought him to the medical bay, where he managed to slip away in the confusion. The reunion with his ship's crew was emotional and brief. Captain Rodriguez, the Harmony's commander, barely had time to express her relief at seeing David. Alive before he was explaining about the impending attack and his desperate plan to stop it. "You want a what?" she asked, staring at David as if he had grown a second head. "Talk to their ships?" "David, you realize how that sounds? I know it's crazy, but it might be our only shot." Princess Leorelle is trying to rally political support, but even if she succeeds, it might not be enough to stop ships that are already in space. As if summoned by his words, Princess Leorelle appeared in the docking bay, having fought her way through palace guards and crossed half the city to reach them, the sight of her tall, graceful, and determined, with colors of resolve flickering across her skin, made David's heart race with emotions that were both his own and reflected from their bond. "The attack has begun," she announced.
Orcs launched
"The fleet early. They'll reach your nearest colony in 6 hours." David felt the weight of failure crushing down on him, but Princess Leorelle's hand on his shoulder steadied him. Through their connection, he felt her unwavering determination and realized that she hadn't given up hope. "The Harmony has powerful communication equipment," she said. "If we can get close enough to the fleet, we might be able to reach the ship mines directly." Captain Rodriguez looked between David and the alien princess, clearly thinking they had both lost their minds. But she was also a veteran of first contact situations, and she had learned to trust unusual solutions to impossible problems. "How close is close enough?" she asked. "Close enough to die if this doesn't work." Princess Lirelei replied honestly. The chase through space was unlike anything David had ever experienced. Through Princess Lirelei's senses, he could feel the massive bioships of the Zephyrian fleet. As they moved toward human space like a pack of hunting predators, each ship was a living creature the size of a city, bred for war and hungry for conflict. But as the Harmony raced after them, David began to sense something else. The ships weren't just following orders, they were confused and conflicted. Many of them had been alive during the previous emperor's reign, when the policy had been to guide younger species rather than destroy them. The sudden shift to aggressive war felt wrong to them, even if they couldn't disobey direct commands.
Ow.
"They're having doubts," David told Princess Lirelei as they worked together at the communication console. "The ships themselves don't want this war." "Then let's give them a reason to stop," she replied. What followed was the strangest conversation in human history. Using the Harmony's transmitters amplified by Princess Lirelei's natural ability to communicate with biotechnology, David began speaking directly to the minds of the attack fleet, not to their commanders, but to the ships themselves. He told them about the sacred bond.
Ow!
For some son all. But more than that, he shared his memories of humans, not as threats or enemies, but as young, curious beings trying to find their place in the galaxy. Through his connection with Princess Lirelei, he showed them her vision of a future where different species worked together instead of fighting. One by one, ships began to slow down. It started with just a few vessels, older bioships that remembered the previous emperor's policies. But as more ships began to question their orders, the effects spread through the fleet like a wave. The ship minds began communicating with each other, sharing the new information and debating whether to continue their mission. Prince Kelrix, commanding from his flagship, realized what was happening and tried to force his ships to obey. But the damage was done. When bioships began to refuse orders, there was no way to control them by force. The attack fleet came to a complete stop just 2 hours away from the first human colony. In the aftermath, everything changed quickly. Princess Lirelei's supporters, emboldened by the failure of Kelrix's attack, moved to support her claim to the throne. The ancient crystal trees had confirmed that the sacred bond was valid despite its interruption, making war between the species legally impossible as long as David and Princess Lirelei remained alive and bonded. Prince Kelrix was arrested for violating sacred law and attempting genocide. The attack fleet, rather than returning home in shame, requested permission to visit human colonies and learn more about the species they had been ordered to destroy. 6 months later, David stood on the observation deck of New Geneva Station, watching as human and Zephyrian ships worked together to build the first joint research facility. Through his bond with Princess Lirelei, he could feel her presence even though she was back on the Zephyrian homeworld, working to reform her people's government. The transformation had been difficult for both of them. David was no longer fully human. He could sense biotechnology, had gained some telepathic abilities, and would live far longer than any normal person. Princess Lirelei faced constant political challenges as the first Zephyrian ruler to be bonded with an alien, but they were building something new together. Human creativity combined with Zephyrian wisdom was producing innovations that neither species could have achieved alone. The first joint exploration mission was being planned. and there were rumors of other species in distant systems who might welcome peaceful contact. Best of all, David was no longer alone. Through their bond, he and Princess Lirelei shared everything: thoughts, emotions, dreams for the future. When she visited Earth for the first time, seeing human cities and meeting human families, David experienced her wonder and joy as if it were his own. When he attended Zephyrian cultural ceremonies, understanding traditions that went back millions of years, he felt her pride in sharing her heritage with him. 3 years after the ceremony that had changed everything, David received news that made him smile. Princess Lirelei was pregnant with their first child, a being that would be part human and part Zephyrian, representing the future of cooperation between their species. Standing on the station's observation deck, watching ships from both worlds, working side by side among the stars, David reflected on the incredible journey that had brought him here. He had started as a nervous language expert, afraid of talking to strangers. Now he was a bridge between worlds, helping to build a future where no species had to face the universe alone. The best part was that this was just the beginning.